Imagine a man, not just any man, but someone who bore the very wounds of Christ. His hands, feet and sides bled like Jesus on the cross, and he lived with those wounds for 50 years. These were not just physical scars, but a sign of his deep connection with the divine. People from all over the world came to see him, convinced that he had the power to heal, guide, and even forgive sins. How could one man live with so much pain and responsibility? But something even more remarkable happened to Padre Pio. Jesus appeared to him, not once, but many times. The most amazing encounter, however, happened shortly before his death. By September 1968, he was 81 years old and frail. He had lived a life of devotion and suffering, bearing the wounds of Christ for decades. As he lay there near the end, he whispered the names Jesus and Mary as he clutched his rosary. In those quiet hours, he saw something no one else could see. He saw two mothers. He was no ordinary priest. He had visions of Jesus weeping over the plight of the world, of priests failing in their sacred duties, and of a world becoming indifferent to suffering and sacrifice. Jesus was not just speaking to Padre Pio, he was speaking to all of us. His message was a warning, a cry of pain from a Savior who still bears the weight of humanity's sins. The story begins on September 20th, 1918. Padre Pio had just celebrated Mass when something extraordinary happened. A profound sense of stillness overcame him, but suddenly, an overwhelming pain overshadowed all other sensations. Suddenly, a mysterious figure appeared before him, with wounds on his hands, feet, and sides. Padre Pio instantly recognized this figure. It was Jesus Christ, and the wounds he suffered were the same as those of the crucifixion. After Jesus disappeared, he realized that his own hands and feet were bleeding. He received the stigmata, the sacred wounds of Christ. The priest, however, accepted them. He perceived this physical pain as a divine gift, a symbol of his selection to partake in Christ's ultimate sacrifice. For the next 50 years, his hands, feet and sides bled continuously, causing him excruciating pain. But he did not run away from it. Instead, he believed that his suffering was a way to redeem others. People flocked to him, believing that the stigmata were a sign of his holiness and that he could guide them to salvation. To them, Padre Pio was a living reminder of Christ's sacrifice. He literally became a bridge between humanity and the divine. But as much as his wounds were a sign of his special connection with God, they were also a burden, both physically and emotionally. He did not just endure the pain in his body, he suffered spiritually as well. The weight of carrying such a responsibility must have been enormous. In letters to his spiritual advisors, he revealed the anguish he felt. He begged God to remove the outward signs of the stigmata, not because he wanted to avoid pain, but because he was deeply embarrassed by the attention they brought him. He feared that people would look at him and see the wounds instead of the message they represented. In the days leading up to his death, the stigma that had bled for half a century suddenly began to close. By the time he died, the wounds had completely disappeared. It was as if they had never been there, leaving only subtle scars. This brings us to the concept of redemption. For him, the pain he endured was never just about suffering, it was about bringing others closer to Christ. Through his wounds, countless people came to understand the depth of Jesus' sacrifice. They saw a reflection of Christ's love in the priest, a man willing to endure unimaginable pain in order to save others. In his suffering, he found purpose and, ultimately, redemption. When we talk about faith, we often think of believing in something we can't see, an invisible force that guides us through life's challenges. But for him, faith wasn't just a concept, it was his entire being's existence. His deep devotion to God, and especially to the Virgin Mary, shaped every moment of his life. He would begin his day at 3:30 a.m., not because he had to, but because he wanted to spend those quiet hours in deep prayer and reflection. Every day he would rise well before the sun and begin the day in meditation, preparing his heart for Holy Mass. For him, this was not just a ritual, it was a sacred moment in which he felt closer to Jesus Christ, Father's devotion to the Mass was unlike anything most of us could imagine. His Eucharistic celebrations were known to last for hours, and during these times he would often be so moved that he would cry or tremble. He believed that when he stood at the altar, he was not just fulfilling a religious duty, he was reliving the passion of Christ. Every action, every word, and every prayer was filled with the deepest reverence, as if he were physically present on Calvary, witnessing the suffering of Jesus. His relationship with the Virgin Mary was equally strong. From a young age, he had a special devotion to Mary, often referring to her as his spiritual mother. He believed that through her intercession, all things were possible. And so whenever he faced trials or moments of doubt, he would turn to the rosary, praying with such intensity that it became his lifeline. For him, it was a spiritual weapon, a tool that gave him strength to fight against the evils of the world. He called it his weapon because he believed that through prayer, especially the rosary, he could protect himself and others from spiritual harm. He once said, "Some people foolishly believe that they can navigate life without the help of the Blessed Mother. But I know that the rosary is the key to overcoming the evils of the world." It is easy to talk about devotion in abstract terms, but for him, it was as real as the wounds he bore on his body. His faith was not passive, it was active. He prayed constantly. Despite all the miracles attributed to him, despite all the people who believed in his healing power, he remained humble. He always pointed people back to God and the Virgin Mary, reminding them that it was through their intercession that miracles happened, not through him. He was merely a vessel, a channel through which God worked. One of Padre Pio's most disturbing visions occurred early in his life, long before his final encounter with Christ. In 1913, 5 years before he received the stigmata, Jesus appeared to him in a way that shook him deeply. This Christ image was not comforting like many of us are used to. No, Jesus looked beaten and bruised, his face full of sadness and disappointment. In this vision, Jesus revealed a vast crowd of priests who were supposed to be the shepherds of his flock, leading people to salvation. He didn't just express disappointment, he used a word that cuts deep. A butcher is someone who kills without mercy, and that's how Jesus felt about how some priests treated their sacred responsibilities. He had entrusted these men with his teachings, his love, and his sacrifice, and they were failing him. Jesus' suffering did not end after a few hours on the cross. No, he revealed to Padre Pio that his suffering would last until the end of the world. Those in positions of spiritual authority, whom he had most blessed, were neglecting their responsibilities. They weren't leading their flocks to God, they were betraying him, and that betrayal added to Jesus' eternal agony. Jesus spoke directly to him, revealing the full extent of his pain. He told the priest that his greatest agony came not from the sins of the world, but from the indifference of his own ministers. The priests, who should have been his closest allies, were actually causing him the greatest suffering. Indifference, not hatred, was the real enemy. Instead of longing for a single drop of human compassion, Jesus felt abandoned, as if his sacrifice on the cross had gone unnoticed. Jesus acknowledged that he occasionally felt tempted to lash out at those who betrayed him, but loving angels and souls who comforted him intervened to restrain him. This gives us a glimpse into the magnitude of his mercy. Even in the face of betrayal, Jesus continued to extend grace. The Father's life was filled with events that were far from ordinary. His deep spiritual connection with God brought him into direct contact with the supernatural in a way that would leave most of us amazed or even afraid. These supernatural experiences were not just brief moments of awe. They were life-changing events that shaped his faith and revealed the divine in a way that few have witnessed. One of the most significant and repeated phenomena in the Father's life was his experience with visions. It wasn't just once or twice that he saw something supernatural. These events happened multiple times throughout his life, shaping not only his faith but also the faith of those around him. In fact, some of these visions were downright terrifying. One of Father's first supernatural encounters occurred when Father was still a young man during his early years in the monastery. At this time, he began to receive visits from demonic entities, creatures who sought to test his faith and break his spirit. These weren't just passing nightmares, they were physical confrontations. He described how these beings tormented him, sometimes leaving his body bruised and battered. These divine encounters weren't just for his personal spiritual growth, they were messages intended for all of us. Through Padre Pio, Jesus communicated his deepest disappointment to the world, especially to those entrusted with the leadership of his followers. He wanted the world to know that the pain he suffered did not end on the cross, that it continued with every sin, every betrayal, and every act of indifference to his love. This alone required us to examine our lives and faith. One of the most astonishing supernatural experiences that people often recall is Padre Pio's ability to bilocate. For Padre Pio, bilocation, being in two places at once, was not just a rumor or a legend, but something many people witnessed. Many people reported seeing him simultaneously in various locations, frequently providing comfort and guidance to those in need. These supernatural events are part of what made Padre Pio such a revered and beloved figure. It was not just miracles, they showed his divine connection. The people who knew him did not simply see him as a priest, they saw him as a living bridge between heaven and earth, a man who had one foot in the spiritual realm and the other on this earthly plane. And through him, countless people were able to experience a glimpse of the divine. He saw these events as part of his mission, not as special gifts designed to elevate his own status. Whether battling demons, communicating with Christ, or appearing to someone in need through bilocation, Padre Pio always pointed people back to God. He stressed that these were God's miracles and that he was just the instrument. Yet, although these events continued throughout his life, they did not shield him from suffering. In fact, the supernatural often added to the burden he carried. Padre Pio's stigmata were not just a physical manifestation of Christ's wounds. They were a sign of his unwavering commitment to sharing in Jesus' suffering. Every drop of blood, every moment of agony, was his way of connecting with the divine. Not complaining but accepting this burden with humility, seeing it as his mission to bring others closer to Christ, is even more powerful. He allowed these struggles to deepen his faith rather than shake it. He shows us that trusting in something greater can give our suffering meaning. It is a reminder that faith is not about living a life free from pain, but about finding purpose and redemption in pain. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Padre Pio's story is that God is always present, even when we feel alone. In the same way that Jesus manifested to Padre Pio during his last moments, we also never experience complete abandonment. If Padre Pio's incredible story and deep faith inspire you, please consider supporting this journey by clicking the Super Thanks button. Your support helps us continue to bring stories of faith, devotion, and hope to more people like you. The divine is always near, always reaching out to us, especially in our darkest hours. Whether through prayer, the sacraments, or those quiet moments of reflection, we all have the opportunity to connect with God in a deep and personal way. When Padre Pio took his last breath on that fateful day in September 1968, whispering the names of Jesus and Mary, we were reminded of the mystery of life and death. He lived his life as a humble servant, bearing the weight of Christ's suffering, and now he was returning to the same God he had served so faithfully. But his story did not end with his death. In fact, it continues to resonate today, offering hope, faith, and inspiration to millions of people. His story is not just a reflection of the past, but a call to live more deeply, to love more fully, and to walk in faith even when the path is hard to see. Keep seeking, keep believing, and perhaps one day we will all discover the message that awaits us at the end of our journey. Thank you for watching this video, and join our community by subscribing to our channel.